Hello, welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms. I'm joined by my bestie and my personal professor, Bob Forrant. Hey Bob, how you doing today?
I'm well. I still have that job, so that's a good thing. That's one of my favorite things to be. So
mine too.
it's very cool.
I get to learn and I get to have fun. Two of my favorite things, and with one of my favorite people.
Thank you.
And last time we talked about some really serious stuff. I mean, I think that we're always talking about really serious stuff on here, but it's relevant to what we're going to talk about today. We were talking about, banning books and changing history, basically, right? A quick summary. Watch the last episode. This episode, though, we'll be talking about how when you're changing history, when you're a person in the big spotlight and you get to say whatever you want, how that can impact groups of people. And specifically, we'll be talking about the rise of anti-Semitism today. But we're going to also go back in history and talk about where it first even came from and how fascism keeps rearing its ugly head. So where should we start, Bob?
Yeah, I mean,
the
thing that's fascinating is how, because we're not taught history, at least I think in our estimation, really well. There's so many gaps. There's so much stuff left out. So each time something happens, like in the last few years, there's been an incredible rise in anti-Semitism in the United States. There have been synagogues shot up. There's just street violence. There's the desecration of monuments and markers, hateful writing on the sides of synagogues, just a whole host of things, and an escalation, even to the point in the local papers in the last 3 or 4 days, there's been documentation of these spikes in violence, in a way similar to what we talked about on one show of sort of anti-Asian violence and sort of people sort of equating COVID to China and anybody that looks Asian getting punched in the face somewhere on the street, and
Deadly
the escalation
rhetoric.
of all of that. And so the thing about the anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism is there's a lot of historical antecedents to it that actually culminate in the Holocaust. But we see all of that resurrected, and because we have such a weak understanding of that period of time, we really don't understand how, so this is the way I think about it when I'm talking to my students. If you hear hate speech of any kind and you let it fester, more than likely, based on the historical understandings we have, the hate speech will escalate fairly rapidly into physical violence, and which is why you need to combat what you hear when you hear it, because once it's sort of like out of the bottle, it's only going to get worse before people step up, and that's really a problem with this particular case that we're seeing today of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, and it's really kind of scary because people can start with something that they don't think is hate speech with ridiculous and outdated conspiracy theories about this cabal that is controlling all of the money in the world, and it just delves into this really hateful spiral where we're seeing, like you said, this uprising and uptick in not just hateful speech but hateful acts. Like I think of back to 2017 with Charlottesville, and it's only gotten worse since then. And this is absolutely outrageous. And how do we combat this? But also, where does this come from?
Yeah, so I mean, in the U.S., right? I mean, a period of time to hone in on, I think, and create a focus on is in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and actually in Massachusetts is one of the hotbeds for this activity. There's a growing intellectual sort of argument to be being made, some of it by elected officials, people in the U.S. Senate, people like Henry Cabot Lodge, who's a senator from Massachusetts, from Beverly Farms. Beverly is where I grew up, so I've always had some historical knowledge of the Lodge family. But Henry Cabot Lodge, faculty members at Harvard, MIT, Yale, Princeton, places like that, are starting to create an argument for ending immigration into America. And the part of the argument is that, and it's targeted specifically to people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the argument is, of those folks from, say, Greece and Italy and Portugal and then in the Middle East, Turkey and countries like that, Syria, Lebanon, but also in Eastern Europe, where there's large numbers of Jewish people living. The argument is that these folks coming are bad immigrants. And they actually talk about how they will, and they use this language, that if we don't stop them from coming, somehow, they're going to diminish the gene pool. They're going to basically take this grand experiment that is America and pollute it and make it a mess. And that we have an intellectual, cultural responsibility. And one of the leaders intellectually of this movement is this guy by the name of Madison Grant, who happens to be the head of the New York Zoological Society, amongst other things. And he writes this screed that's titled The Passing of the Great Race. And what he's talking about is sort of Nordic, Anglo-Saxon sort of amalgamation of cultures and people who are white, and sort of like that's the good immigrants. And they argue that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and Jewish people are included in this collection of people that they're wagging their fingers at, have too many kids. And that the good stock are afraid, this is the logic they use, are afraid and are having too few kids. And so that in 50 to 75 years, if we don't stop these other people from coming in, they're going to overrun us.
It's almost like I'm listening to the rhetoric that we hear today.
Hence the passing of the great race.
Oh my goodness.
Right? These hordes will overwhelm us. And so they create this lexicon which they use of different groups from different parts of the world having these different propensities to crime. Like if you're from Italy, you're carrying a knife and you're going to stab somebody, right? I mean, these are these generalizations, and then in these books and articles that they write, they create these whole typologies of people by race and religion. And Jews become one of the explicit targets in the 1920s, and Hitler actually looks at what's happening here. For some of the rhetoric and the language, some of this sort of this pseudoscience that's used in the US to justify trying to stop people from coming in, he adopts as part of what he's going to then put forward as he begins to institute what he's doing in Germany.
Oh my goodness, I feel like it always starts here.
Some way, somehow, there's a link.
Wow.
It's like people in Lowell think everything goes through Lowell.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, I absolutely think that.
6 degrees of separation. If there's some weird stuff going on,
Yeah.
we're in on it somehow.
And it did trickle down here, right? There was anti-Semitism happening in Lowell
Absolutely.
at the time. And didn't we have, like this is like around that time, wasn't there like a lot of rise in hate here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the books I have here that sort of on display here is Nazis of Copley Square. People forget or never knew. If you forget, it assumes that you knew it and then forgot it. People either never knew or knew and forgot that in the late 1920s, early 1930s, there was definitely a solidarity in some parts of the United States in support of what Hitler was doing. And there was a Nazi political party. There's some very chilling video of Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden in New York City. And this book is really a documentation this is written by a historian who teaches at Boston College of sort of the growth and development of this movement in Boston and the suburbs of Boston. And so, yeah, but we do think, I think the more recent folks growing up in Massachusetts somehow do think of this as a liberal state, and we forget these sort of historical historical past. And so all of this is deeply embedded in the fabric. And then, I mean, it translates into sort of in the 1920s. So there's an attempt, again, as early as the 1890s with in the House and the Senate of the United States to stop immigration from coming in from certain parts of the world,
Right.
the so-called bad immigrants.
And the doors were open at first, and then we started seeing them.
Right, and so a variety of, right, so very much sort of like the idea of visas and things like that and passports and all those sorts of things are not things that we're doing in any kind of a systematic way. We're not really counting that well. We start being more careful about counting how many people are coming in the late 1890s when Ellis Island opens. Mm. And then slowly but surely we start introducing things like a means test. Do people come with money? We create a small head tax on people when they're coming in to see if they have any money, because the language that gets used is we don't want people coming in who would be quote unquote wards of the state, meaning that they're paupers, they're poor, right? Whatever it would be. Then we start doing, right, then we start doing physical exams to sort of health check, health screen people. We start doing mental testing. If people seem, in the language of the day, feeble-minded, we can kick them out. And so there's an escalation of these things, including a literacy test. But then by 1915, this idea has really gone full steam of there are people coming from countries that are bad countries, and we need to keep those people out. All these other things that I was describing are largely applied to everybody gets a health screening, everybody gets a means test of some sort, a literacy test, irrespective of where you come from, unless you're wealthy. If you're wealthy, you just whisk through Ellis Island, but everybody else, irrespective of where they come from. But now the idea is let's stop people from coming.
Altogether.
From Europe, let's not let them even leave. And how do we go about setting up something like that? That's sort of the next phase of this story, and that then has specific overtones of anti-Semitism.
Oh my goodness. And then the war happens. And we didn't even want to be, America didn't want to be involved in this war,
right,
because it was not in our interest until it was. And then suddenly we're on the side of the good guys.
Yep.
What happened there?
Public sentiment in the United States in the late 1920s, early 1930s, as we know, as we're becoming aware internally that Hitler's gaining power, momentum, and steam, that Mussolini's doing the same, that Mussolini in Italy is using his military to invade Ethiopia and other parts of northern Africa to sort of get oil and other resources, and Hitler's expanding into Czechoslovakia and Poland. We're aware of his decrees against Jewish people living in Germany. So if you look at the newspapers of the day, we're aware of what's happening, but the person on the street, if polled about should we intervene, should we try to stop what's happening, particularly to Jews in Europe, the overwhelming answer is no, it's not our fight. Wow. And the difficulty, again, sort of why language matters, why words matter, in the conversations about stopping immigration, eventually a bill gets passed by Congress and signed by the president that creates quotas for who can and can't come into the United States. And they're really, again, the proponents of the quota system are clever. They don't say we don't want Italians to come in. They don't say we don't want Eastern European Jewish people to come in. We don't want Polish people to come in. They basically say, even though it's foolishness, they say America's full. And because America is full, we have to stop the open doors of immigration. We have to curtail immigration. We have to cut back on who can come in. And to be fair, we'll just do it by math. And we'll basically say, so this is the equation they come up with initially. Based on the population in the United States as of 1910, 2% annually from those countries can come into the United States. So depending on how many people from England or France or Germany or Poland or whatever are in the United States in the 1910 census, 2% of that number can come in as immigrants in the next several years.
Right.
And people would have to now go for the first time to an embassy or a consulate, get on a list, get a visa, and they would be counted as they came in. And so this passes in 1921. But then they realized they made a mistake. The math doesn't work. Because by choosing 1910, there's already been an influx of Eastern European, Russian, and other Jewish folks coming in, as well as Italians, Lithuanians, Poles, Portuguese workers. Because the biggest influx from Southern and Eastern Europe comes between like 1890 and 1910. So now they say, well, we need to amend the law.
Of course.
And we need to make the fraction for how we're going to count be 1890. And so making the fraction 1890 means, so this is what happens, right? So this is I brought data because I didn't want to, it's too hard for me to remember these figures in my head,
we're
right?
Not mathematicians.
Yeah, I'm old, right? Anyway, so people coming in from Eastern European countries prior to, say, between 1890 and 1910, in Italy, right, on average, about 95 to 100,000 people are coming in a year. But by picking 1890, it drops down to 3,800.
Of course.
So only 3,800 people can come in. Czechoslovakia, only 3,700. Russia, only 2,200. So these are the countries with a fairly significant Jewish population trying to get out of Eastern Europe, trying to get out of Russia. Lithuania, only 344 people. Spain, 131 people. Only 131 people can come in. Greece, 100. So by using 1890, right? So when the quota system gets put in place, they cap annual immigration into the United States at about 170,000. But of those 170,000 people, 87% come from Western and Northern European countries.
The good
Countries, and only 14%. And so in Africa, total quota coming in from Africa are 1,000 people.
The entire continent.
The entire continent.
Oh my goodness.
Syria 100, Turkey 100, Egypt 100, let's see, Estonia 124, Albania 100, Bulgaria 100. That's it. And so that's on the books in 1924. And that's basically the way American immigration policy is going to go. So now, this is where it gets really bad. As Hitler is rising to power, increasing numbers of Eastern European Jewish people understand what's coming and want to get out. We actually prevent people, refugees, from coming into the United States. We turn ships away.
Oh my goodness.
We will not let people in. They're on the high seas, they fled Poland or Czechoslovakia or Germany, or they emigrated out of Germany because they saw what was coming and went to France, but now they're trying to come from France, but because they have German passports and papers, they're counted against the German quota. And so when people get here, if the quota's full, at Ellis Island, we basically turn people, we can't get off.
Oh my God, what do they do?
They have to go back.
Oh. This is and I know this, but it's stressing me out to hear this even now. It's such a horror story.
Yeah.
I can't believe, I can't
And
believe
so the president when all this is happening is Franklin Roosevelt, who's considered like the liberal of all presidents, right?
Yeah.
Franklin Roosevelt's like a deity in Democratic Party households. And he's the president, and people in various Jewish organizations in the US are appealing to him saying, look, we get the quota or whatever, but this is like a special circumstance. This is an emergency.
Watch what's happening.
Look what's going on. There's a ship, out in the harbor in New York with 900 people on it. You won't let them off. And there are ships that are actually going up and down the East Coast trying to find somebody that will let them, ships that even go to Cuba.
Oh my goodness.
To try to disembark their passengers in Cuba. And because Cuba's following what the US is doing, they won't let people off in Cuba either. And so these people become nomads because they can't go back. obviously, to where they came from, or if they do, they obviously face the same peril as other people who ultimately aren't able to get out. But again, sort of the way this usually is dealt with in American history is it's not taught.
This is a crucial part of this history.
To me, anyway.
Right.
To us.
Yeah.
For sure, right? And so, I mean, the interesting thing is that, which is fascinating to me, Ken Burns, the video maker par excellence, right, who does all this stuff, actually just did a 4-part documentary on this history. And I was really surprised because it did put the story more in the mainstream. And I'm thinking he probably did it partly because he understood, like, we're in a moment where these things are happening again, and people are weak on the history and don't understand that if you just sort of allow this to happen, it sort of snowballs into something, far worse. And we don't change. So this quota system I'm talking about with these numbers, this stays on the books till 1965.
Yeah, I was going to say the 60s, yeah.
We make exceptions to get people out of, like, East Germany during the Cold War, because it's like a political, it's like a political one-up on the Soviet Union, which has created this wall, divided Berlin, and now occupies half of Germany. And so we were even bringing in people from East Germany who might have been complicit, in the Holocaust and in the concentration camp deaths, but we're just bringing people in. And ultimately, that's why, I mean, ultimately a lot of these people get discovered as living in the United States who had been involved in the atrocities and in the concentration camps. But we definitely are trying to get people in from Hungary and Poland. We do the same with getting people in from Cuba after Castro takes power in the early 60s in Cuba. And so we make
so afraid of communism.
Yeah, we make political allowances that way. But this is really a moment where, again, there were not a lot of people who were brave in saying, "Hey, wait a minute. Yeah, we get it. The quotas, blah blah blah, federal law, but special circumstance here. We need to rethink, like, what we're doing with this system, with this going on in the world." When we were putting these quotas in place, this wasn't happening. This is a different ball game. But we're so devoid of empathy for what's happening in Europe as the war is growing and as Hitler's gaining momentum and Mussolini's gaining momentum and Franco in Spain, that Congress is just not interested.
And it seems like we're doing kind of a similar thing now, where nobody's being brave. Nobody is saying, actually, here are the facts. And this is what really happened. And then you have people who are celebrities in the public eye who are being emboldened and now denying the Holocaust even happened when we know that it how can you sit there, and especially I take particular umbrage with folks who are Black, who are denying the Holocaust, because hello, like, you are, especially if you're an American Black person, you are a descendant of an enslaved person. So how could you sit there and know that people are also denying your experience, denying the experience of your ancestors, and do the same thing? Why is that? Why are you doing this?
Yeah, which is actually what's happening, right? We're trying to take teaching Black history out of the schools.
Right.
It's a similar kind of a phenomenon, right? I was listening on public radio yesterday to I forget the name of the group, but there's a rise of one of these sort of like the Proud Boys, another organization that started out on the West Coast and now sort of moving east, and now they've set up a base in Florida, outspokenly anti-Jewish and going into temples on Saturdays and disrupting services, and went to Germany, went to some of the concentration camp sites and stood outside basically saying it was a hoax, didn't happen, and sort of very much sort of becoming much more emboldened and much more in the public eye. Really strong in California, really strong in Florida and New York State. But again, each time that takes over the airwaves and goes unresponded, in Charlottesville, which you mentioned, I mean, the slogan that was being chanted in the rallies there is "You will not replace us." And again, it's this language from back here.
Right.
That was the language of the folks, like this book, The Guarded Gate, is really all about sort of the eugenics movement and this sort of pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-scientific arguments being made to ultimately culminate in immigration restriction, and this one as well, America for Americans, because that was, again, sort of these slogans.
Right. I've heard this one.
Yeah,
Recently,
and
yeah.
I mean, a lot of focus, and again, it's how this, what's scary about this is, because we don't see the history well and it's not taught and sequenced really well, a lot of this book deals with the West Coast and deals with Chinese migration into the country from the West Coast around the gold rush and building the railroads, and all these people were recruited to come in to do all this hard labor.
Right.
And then once the work was done, we wanted them gone. And so the Chinese must go was a political slogan on the West Coast throughout the 1880s and 1890s. And something called the Chinese Exclusion Act gets passed. And the Chinese Exclusion Act is very much sort of the forerunner of the quota. The Chinese Exclusion Act is the first time there's something specifically targeted, naming a country, naming a nationality, right? And so once that passes, now you've opened the door. Well, okay, well, if we could ban the Chinese.
Then we can
And
ban
so we
all
even
other
say to the
groups.
Chinese who are here, can't become citizens.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And threaten them, those who are already here, by taking their papers, report on other people. Oh my goodness. And it's just so terrifying. I know that we say we have to be careful of looking at the correlations. We can't look at it always side by side. But it's really frightening to see these similarities coming from 100 years ago to now. And like we always talk about it on this show, we talk about the importance of uplifting the stories of folks who often get forgotten, but we also have to tell these stories that we do know,
Right.
and we have to tell them in detail because there are other people who are louder, who have more power, who have more money, who are trying to just really, those are the people who are ruining America.
Yeah, I mean, and when these things happen, then these stories go underground because people are afraid. This is why so many people change their name, right? Even though, I mean, they have a last name that's clearly Italian or, you know, Polish or whatever it might be, or, you know, somebody could think, well, that's a Jewish last name or whatever it would be, right? And so people are afraid to be, you know, who they are.
One of the lessons I'm taking away from this is racism, bigotry, xenophobia, anti-Semitism impacts all of us. It's not just a one group issue. And when you see a group being targeted, you have to speak up. You have to be brave. It doesn't matter. We have to band together. There needs to be solidarity. We have to stop fascism in its tracks. We have to. We cannot have a repeat of this. Oh my goodness. Bob, thank you so much for, of course, everything that you do, but bringing this history forward. And I hope those who are tuning in at home, you think a little deeper about what you hear on social media and on TV. Read these books. Just think critically about your fellow person. This has been History on Lowell. Thank you for tuning in.
Lala Books will order these for you.
Lowell Books.